March 4th, 1945, began long before the women inside the transport lorry realized the sun had even risen. The world outside was a grey blur, a damp American dawn somewhere in the Carolinas. But the inside of the lorry felt more like a forgotten cellar, dark, cramped, and filled with the stale smell of wet wool, mud, and weeks-old fear. 37 British servicewomen, nurses, clerks, drivers, mechanics, and radio operators were pressed shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in tattered coats that no longer kept out the cold. They had survived German captivity, chaotic transfers, interrogations, shared bunks with lice, nights where the temperature dropped low enough to freeze breath on the inside of windows, and meals so thin they barely counted as food. Now they were being moved again, though no one knew exactly where or why. All they knew was that the Americans had taken custody of them 2 days earlier, promising better treatment, medical checks, and something called real breakfast. But after months of living off cabbage water, bark-coloured coffee, and crusts thin enough to snap in half, none of them trusted words anymore. Corporal Anne Felton sat wedged between 2 other women, hugging her knees, her fingers stiff and raw. She had been a dispatch rider before the ambush that took her motorcycle, her freedom, and nearly her life. Her left boot was still split from when she'd kicked out a frozen barn door during an attempted escape 3 months earlier. She could still feel the German guard's hand yanking her backward by the collar. Anne breathed slowly, watching faint ribbons of her breath hang in the cold air, and listened to the dull groan of the lorry's engine as it rolled along a gravel road. She had lost track of time hours ago. Her stomach growled, a deep, hollow sound that made the woman next to her smile bitterly. Hunger, at least, was familiar. Private Lily Armitage, the smallest and youngest of the group, leaned her head against the wooden slats of the side wall, peeking through a thin crack. She could see tall pine trees rolling past and what looked like fences in the distance. "Do you think they'll give us food today?" she whispered, not to anyone in particular. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible over the rattling boards. Sergeant Margaret Hensley snorted softly. She had led a medical transport convoy in North Africa before being captured. Her once proud posture had been worn down by exhaustion. But her voice still carried authority. "They gave us something last night, didn't they?" she muttered. "That brown bean slop." "That was yesterday," Lily said. "My stomach doesn't remember it." No one laughed, but a few smiles flickered silently, small, fragile human reactions that felt foreign after so many months in captivity. The lorry slowed. The women tensed. Boots thudded on the ground outside. Voices, American accents, shouted instructions. A bolt slid. The rear doors groaned open, spilling in a cold wash of pale morning light. Some women raised hands to shield their eyes. Others simply blinked, adjusting slowly, disbelief settling over their faces. For the first time in months, they saw friendly uniforms. 2 American MPs stood by the ramp, their jackets crisp, their boots clean, their expressions surprisingly gentle. "Ladies," one said, tipping his helmet in a respectful nod, "welcome to Camp Tulliver. You're safe now. We're going to get you warm, cleaned up, checked by a doctor, and fed properly. Step down slow, one at a time." Safe, fed properly, warm, words that sounded almost fictional. Anne waited her turn, feeling the boards shift under her as the women ahead climbed down. When she stepped onto the gravel, her knees nearly buckled from stiffness. A guard reached out instinctively to steady her. She flinched at the touch. He froze, hands raised. "Sorry, ma'am," he murmured carefully. "Just didn't want you falling." No German guard had ever apologized for touching her. The women were guided toward a row of low wooden buildings surrounded by white fences. Beyond them stood taller pine trees, their needles shimmering with dew. The air smelled different here, cleaner, warmer, carrying faint scents of smoke, pine sap, and something else. Something savoury, rich, warm. Whatever it was drifted toward them from the far end of the compound, floating through the morning air like a promise. Lily stopped walking. "Do you smell that?" Every woman around her paused. Yes, something smelled incredible, comforting, unbelievably good. It wasn't cabbage water, it wasn't dried turnips, it wasn't burned ersatz coffee. This was creamy, peppery, something like roasted flour. No one could place it. Margaret inhaled deeply, closing her eyes. Whatever that is, it's not German. A young American MP walked alongside them, clipboard in hand. "We've got breakfast ready for you all. Biscuits and gravy, scrambled eggs, fruit preserves." The British women slowed again. "Biscuits?" Anne echoed suspiciously. "Gravy?" She imagined British biscuits, sweet, crisp, tea-dunking biscuits, custard creams, rich teas, digestives, jam shortbread. None of them went with gravy. Gravy belonged with roast beef, not dessert. The MP laughed. "Not sweet biscuits, these are American biscuits, kind of like fluffy bread, soft, buttery. You pour sausage gravy on them." 37 British POWs stared in confused silence, every face showing the same thought. What on earth is he talking about? The MP smiled awkwardly. "You'll see. It's good. Real good." They continued walking, though each step felt heavier with bewilderment. In the mess hall doorway, the warmth hit them first. A thick wave of heat from stoves and steam kettles. Their skin prickled. The tips of their fingers tingled painfully as cold blood met warm air. Then the smell struck them fully, creamy, meaty, peppery, rich, unlike anything they had ever tasted. To women who had spent months starving, the scent was overwhelming. Inside, American cooks moved quickly behind long counters, scraping ladles across metal trays, stacking fluffy biscuits into deep pans, pouring thick white speckled gravy over the top until it steamed. A pot of scrambled eggs the size of a laundry basin hissed softly. Pitchers of milk, actual milk, rested beside bowls of warm applesauce. It was like walking into a dream. Anne swallowed hard. She hadn't seen food like this since before North Africa. Lily's knees wobbled again, not from weakness this time, but from disbelief. "This can't all be for us," she whispered. "It is," the MP said gently. "Eat as much as you want, and yes, if you're wondering." He smirked lightly, as if he'd been briefed on British humour. "There are leftovers." Several women actually gasped. German camps never had leftovers, not even on paper. The cooks, big men with rolled sleeves and aprons stained by honest work, looked up as the women entered, their faces softened with the kind of sympathy that comes from understanding suffering in others. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, stepped forward. "Morning, ladies. You came a long way. Grab a tray. Let's fix you a proper southern breakfast." Margaret stepped forward first, as any senior NCO would. She held the tray tightly, the metal cold in her hands. She approached the first station. The cook grabbed a biscuit the size of her fist, split it open, steam rolling out, and ladled thick sausage gravy over the top until it dripped down the sides. "Here you go, Mum." Margaret stared at it as if it were treasure. Her throat tightened. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said firmly. "You're safe now. Eat." Anne and Lily followed close behind, their trays shaking slightly. When Anne's plate received its own heavy biscuit drowned in creamy, pepper-speckled gravy, she couldn't help it. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears she'd never admit to. The women carried their trays to long wooden tables. The benches were sturdy, warm to the touch, nothing like the cold metal prison canteens they'd endured. Every clatter of cutlery felt loud, almost startling. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lily cut into her biscuit. A small hiss of steam escaped the fluffy centre. She lifted the fork to her mouth cautiously, half afraid this was all some trick, some hallucination brought on by hunger. The moment the food touched her tongue, her eyes widened. It was soft, rich, savoury, warm. The gravy tasted like pepper and sausage and comfort. Her throat closed and she swallowed hard. She took another bite, and another. Her shoulders trembled, and suddenly tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Anne watched her, then took her own first bite. The warmth spread through her, like she had swallowed a sunbeam. Months of cold, hunger, fear, humiliation, it all cracked inside her. She put her fork down, hand covering her mouth as she silently cried, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. All around the hall, the same thing happened. Women eating slowly at first, then hungrily, then shakily, trying to hold themselves together, trying to accept that this kindness was real. A few of the Americans stepped outside quietly, giving them privacy. Others pretended not to notice tears dropping into Biscuits. No one mocked them. No one rushed them. No one barked orders. When Margaret finally finished her plate, she stood slowly, walked back to the counter and cleared her throat. May I have more?" The cook smiled softly, sliding another biscuit onto her plate. "That's why I made so many, Ma'am." Margaret blinked. "You made them for us?" "All of them," he said. "And if that runs out, we've got leftovers." This time she didn't hold back the tears at all. And for the first time in months, the British women ate until they were full. Not ration full, not survival full, but truly, humanly full. Something inside them began to thaw, a piece of their dignity restored one warm bite at a time. They didn't know it yet. But this breakfast, simple, hearty, overwhelmingly generous, would become the moment that defined their arrival in America. The moment they understood they were no longer prisoners, they were guests, they were survivors, they were women who mattered again. And long after the plates were cleared and the cooks returned to their work, the same whisper repeated through the hall, passed from table to table with astonished voices and trembling, grateful smiles. "Are there leftovers?" Because for women who had lived on scarcity, the idea of abundance felt like a miracle. The warmth of the meal lingered inside the women long after the plates were cleared, settling into them like a reminder that they were still alive. The cooks had stepped back, the MPs waited respectfully by the wall. And sunlight from the high mess hall windows stretched across the wooden tables in soft amber bars. For the first time in months, no one barked orders, no one shouted, no one rushed them. They sat in silence, hands still curled around their empty mugs, afraid that if they moved too quickly, the fragile sense of safety might break. Anne Felton inhaled slowly, feeling the warmth seep into her chest. It felt foreign, almost wrong, to sit at a table without worrying someone would yank the food away. Her eyes drifted to the doorway, where an American nurse waited with a clipboard. "Ladies," the nurse finally said, "when you're ready, we'll take you for medical checks. No rush, just whenever you feel steady again." "Steady," Margaret murmured under her breath. "Haven't felt that in a year." Outside, the sunlight cut across the compound, throwing sharp shadows from the barracks and laundry lines. As the women stepped out of the mess hall, they blinked again, adjusting to the brightness. A breeze carried the scent of pine needles and damp soil, a world away from the sour, metallic smell of German camps. The contrast tugged at something deep inside each of them, forcing memories to the surface they had tried so hard to bury. Lily Armitage walked beside Anne, clutching her elbows, her breath rising in unsteady shivers. Lily had been the youngest in her ATS signals unit, barely 19 when she first deployed. She had been captured in Normandy, along with 3 other girls who had been decoding frontline transmissions. She remembered the day vividly. They had been stationed in a farmhouse, radios humming, maps pinned to walls. A German armoured car rolled in faster than anyone expected. Someone shouted to hide the documents. Lily had shoved a ledger under the floorboards but didn't have time to run. A soldier grabbed her by the arm and dragged her outside. She still remembered the mud on his boots and the way her codebook slipped from her other hand, hitting the ground with a small, pathetic thud. As she walked now across the American camp, she could still feel the cold stone floor of the German holding cell. She could still hear the questions, the slaps, the soldiers tapping their fingers impatiently on tables as they demanded to know what she transmitted. She had told them nothing, not because she was brave, but because she was too terrified to speak at all. They mistook her silence for defiance. The interrogator called her the little mute. But at night, when they left her alone, she cried silently into her sleeve, mouthing the same words over and over. Just survive. Just survive until someone finds you. Now the nurse leading her toward the infirmary turned back and smiled gently. "You're safe," she said. Lily nodded, but her throat tightened. Safe. She didn't know how to feel that word yet. Across the path, Sergeant Margaret Hensley walked with her jaw clenched. The bright day made her squint, and each sound, a shovel hitting gravel, boots crunching, distant laughter, seemed too loud, too free. Margaret had been captured in Tunisia after her medical convoy was overrun. Her unit had been parked near a dry ravine, attending to wounded infantry when a burst of machine gun fire ripped through the air. She remembered dragging a British corporal behind a truck, her hands soaked in his blood, when German soldiers swarmed them. She had looked directly into the eyes of a young German lieutenant who pointed his pistol at her. For a moment, she thought he would shoot her for resisting. Instead, he ordered her to stand. She told him to bugger off. He twisted her arm behind her back until she dropped to her knees. She had not cried then. She had not cried through interrogation. She had not cried when they marched her and 20 other prisoners through dust for 20 miles without water. But here, now, surrounded by Americans who treated her like a human being instead of an inconvenience, she felt her chest tighten in a way that threatened to collapse her ribs. When a young American orderly held open the infirmary door for her, she hesitated. Kindness made her feel unsteady. It loosened everything she had welded shut inside herself. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. Inside, the infirmary was warm, clean, and orderly. Cabinets lined the walls, neatly labelled with surgical gauze, iodine, morphine, quinine. Beds had crisp white sheets. There were no bars on the windows. A nurse motioned for the women to sit on benches while they waited. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and soap. Real soap, not the chalky blocks stolen from German barracks. Anne lowered herself onto the bench and stared at her hands. They were rough, red, and cracked from months of cold and work. She remembered when they didn't look like this. She had been a dispatch rider in Egypt before everything fell apart. She remembered the scorching sun, the engines rumbling beneath her legs, the thrill of racing through dust with messages strapped to her chest. She loved the freedom of it, the wind tearing through her hair, the roar of her motorcycle, the knowledge that speed meant saving lives. Her capture had been humiliatingly simple. A mine exploded on the track in front of her. She flew over the handlebars. When she opened her eyes, she was staring up at a sky that wasn't blue anymore, but grey. Germans surrounded her. One slapped her to test consciousness. She spit blood at him. He smiled and tossed her onto a truck. Months later, after starvation, beatings, and moments where she nearly gave up, she sat here now, wrapped in an American wool blanket the nurse had draped over her shoulders. She held it tightly, letting the softness soak into her bones. When the American medic gently lifted her swollen ankle and inspected the old injury from when she'd kicked down that frozen barn door trying to escape, she flinched again. Not from pain, but from the gentleness. "You didn't let that heal properly," he murmured, wrapping it carefully. "You've had a rough time." Anne stared at him. In German custody, a medic had once reset her fractured finger by slamming it against a table. This man apologized when he touched her. Nearby, Lily sat with her legs dangling from the exam table, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The nurse checked her pulse, looked at her pupils, and frowned softly. "You're dehydrated and exhausted. You'll need rest, real rest. We'll make sure of it." Lily nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, women hung laundry on lines, a luxury she hadn't seen in months. Sheets flapping in the wind looked unreal, almost like something from a past life. As the nurse listened to her breathing, Lily was transported back to her first week in captivity. She remembered the German sergeant who smirked at her tears, telling her British women were weak, that they didn't endure hardship like German women. She had believed him for months. Yet here she was, alive, still breathing, sitting in a room filled with warmth and sunlight. Margaret sat on another bench as a doctor examined her ribs. She winced when he pressed one spot. He raised an eyebrow. "How long ago was that fracture?" 3 months, she said. "You didn't get treatment, did you?" She looked away. Treatment? No. German guards had told her to keep working. One had laughed, saying pain made prisoners more obedient. The doctor scribbled a note. "We'll bind that. You'll need rest. And proper meals." Meals. The thought of breakfast made her chest ache again. She remembered hunger in the German camp so vividly, it was like a ghost hovering beside her. The watery soup, the stale crusts, the cold metal bowls. She remembered fighting with a French prisoner once over, who had gotten the larger piece of turnip in their broth. They had apologized afterward, ashamed. Hunger made enemies out of allies. Now, in America, the cooks had asked if they wanted seconds. As the doctor wrapped her ribs, Margaret's mind wandered further back to the night she was captured. She had been tending to a wounded gunner in the convoy when tanks rolled through the darkness, grinding the sand beneath their tracks. Flares lit the sky like falling stars. The wounded man had gripped her sleeve, begging her not to leave him. She stayed, even as German soldiers stormed their position. She had been dragged away mid-bandage, thrown into a truck while still holding a roll of gauze. For weeks she'd woken at night, dreaming she still heard the gunner's voice begging her to return. The nurse now tied the last knot and stepped back. "You're safe," she repeated softly. Margaret nodded slowly, but her throat tightened again. Safety was a language she no longer spoke fluently. Across the room, another woman, Private Eleanor Marsh, sat staring at her reflection in a mirror above the wash basin. Eleanor had been a mechanic before the German retreat caught her unit off guard. She had greasy hands, permanently stained fingernails, and a knack for repairing engines faster than most men in her company. The Germans had mocked her when they found out. A woman, fixing trucks. One guard had laughed as she twisted a wrench, calling her the little engineer. They made her fix their own vehicles. Some days they rewarded her with stale bread. Other days they punished her for taking too long. She raised a hand to her face now, touching the hollows beneath her eyes. She hardly recognized herself. The American nurse approached her with a comb and a bowl of warm water. "May I?" Eleanor nodded faintly. The nurse dipped the comb, gently running it through the knotted curls that had not been washed properly in months. Eleanor closed her eyes. The simple act made her want to weep. She remembered washing her hair back home with lavender soap. She remembered humming as she worked on engines, sleeves rolled up, grease on her cheek. That woman felt gone, replaced by someone who flinched at shadows. As the nurse combed her hair, Eleanor remembered the day the Germans retreated north, dragging prisoners with them, forcing them through icy mud. She remembered falling, scraping her knees, being yanked back to her feet. She remembered the nights they slept in barns so cold she could feel frost forming in her nostrils. She remembered sharing a blanket with Anne once, just to keep their fingers from going numb. Now, in this room, the comb slid through her hair without snagging. The warm water dripped down her neck. She swallowed hard. In another corner of the infirmary sat Sergeant Dorothy Clark, staring at the bandage the American medic was changing on her left arm. She had been shot during an escape attempt the previous winter. She and 2 other women had slipped out through a broken gate when snowstorm winds masked the sound of their footsteps. They made it 2 miles before guards found them. One of the others, a nurse named Helen, had been dragged back by her hair. Dorothy had fought, swinging a branch like a club. A guard fired, hitting her arm. She was forced to walk back through the snow with blood dripping down to her fingers. Now the medic gently applied fresh gauze. Dorothy watched his hands closely, expecting roughness, expecting pain, but he was careful, almost delicate. "Does this hurt?" he asked. "No," she said, surprised by her own answer. Dorothy looked away, blinking hard. She remembered the German medic who had treated her wound after the shooting. He had pressed a cloth to it so roughly she screamed. He told her she was lucky. He told her prisoners didn't need perfect healing to survive. Here, the American medic said, "You'll heal nicely." One sentence spoken softly nearly broke her. Outside, the sun rose higher. Through the infirmary windows, the women saw American soldiers playing catch, laughing, moving freely, confident in their safety. The British women watched them with a strange mixture of longing and disbelief. Freedom felt like a foreign country. When the exams were done, the women were handed new clothing, clean dresses, warm wool sweaters, soft undergarments. They were given towels and told they could shower privately with hot water that lasted more than 30 seconds. The concept made some of them freeze in place. Hot water, privacy, towels that weren't shared. It felt like another world. As they walked toward the shower block, the weight of their pasts pressed heavily against the relief of the present. Anne touched her ankle and remembered frozen mud. Lily touched her neck and remembered the interrogator's hand gripping her hair. Eleanor touched her scalp and remembered weeks without a comb. Margaret touched her ribs and remembered the kick of the German guard's boot. Dorothy touched her bandaged arm and remembered the snow turning red beneath her. Walking through the American camp, the contrast made every memory sharper. They had survived captivity, starvation, interrogation, humiliation, and fear so constant it felt like air. But they had also survived something else: hopelessness. They had survived the nights when they weren't sure they'd ever see freedom again. Now, as steam drifted out of the shower block vents and sunlight warmed the gravel beneath their boots, something inside them shifted, slowly, tentatively, painfully. Hope returned, not all at once, not in some dramatic moment, but in small, trembling breaths, in the clean smell of soap, in the warmth of sunlight, in the promise of more food, in the fact that no one shouted, no one threatened, no one grabbed them. As they stepped inside the shower block, their ghosts followed, but for the first time in months, the ghosts were fading. And while none of them said it aloud, every woman felt the same thought rise gently within her. Maybe this is the first day of getting myself back. Steam curled through the shower block like soft clouds, drifting past warm lamps and bouncing faintly off tiled walls that gleamed in a way none of the British women had seen in months. The pipes hummed, water thundering behind curtains, and for the first time since their capture, the sound of running water didn't mean fear. It meant heat. It meant comfort. It meant enough. Anne stood beneath the spray with her hands braced against the wall, head bowed as the hot water cascaded down her back, melting layers of cold that clung to her like armor. Dirt she didn't know she still carried slid away in dark rivulets, swirling into the drain. She felt pieces of herself melt with it. Hands that had tightened into fists for months now rested open at her sides. Her breath trembled, but not from pain, from release. She didn't rush. None of them did. For the first time in captivity, time belonged to them. Lily finished her shower and stared at herself in the mirror, wiping away fog with a towel. She hardly recognized the girl who stared back. Her cheeks were hollow, yes, but her eyes looked less frantic. The shadows beneath them seemed lighter. She touched the glass gently, remembering the interrogation room where the German sergeant had demanded her codes. She had been sure she would die there. Now, with warm skin and clean hair, she whispered to her reflection, "You survived." The words felt foreign, almost too heavy for her tongue, but they were true. Margaret adjusted the clean sweater the Americans had given her, inhaling the faint scent of detergent. She stood straighter now, despite her bound ribs. Pain still pulsed faintly, but it didn't dominate her thoughts as it once had. As she tied her hair back, she remembered a night in the Tunisian camp when she had torn strips from a blanket to make bandages for a wounded French prisoner. She remembered the guard who threw her into the dirt for wasting supplies. She remembered hiding scraps of bread in her sleeves for the other women. She remembered how hunger had become a companion. Now, the smell of biscuits and gravy lingered faintly in her senses, a reminder that things could be different. Eleanor sat on a bench, towel wrapped around her shoulders, her hair clean and tamed for the first time in months. She held her repaired boots in her hands, tracing the cracked leather with her fingers. A memory tugged at her, sharp and clear. Her last day before deployment, leaning over an engine with sunlight pouring through the workshop windows, humming while tightening bolts. She had loved that work, loved the power it gave her, loved how the men in her unit respected her skill. The Germans had tried to break that pride. But here, now, in the quiet warmth of the shower block, she could feel that girl returning. Dorothy sat near the heater, letting the warm air touch her face. She watched droplets slide down her bandaged arm. Her escape attempt had nearly cost her life, but it had also preserved something vital: her refusal to break. She remembered Helen, the nurse dragged back by her hair. She remembered the sound of the gunshot that tore through her arm. She remembered the cold snow swallowing her footsteps. That memory still lived inside her, heavy and dark. But here, in this camp, surrounded by women who also survived impossible things, the memory felt less suffocating, less defining. When they finally stepped out of the shower block, wrapped in clean clothes, their hair soft, their skin warm, the world outside seemed brighter than it had when they arrived. The gravel crunched under their new boots. Sunlight streamed through pine branches, casting patterns on the ground. American soldiers glanced at them respectfully, some nodding, some offering shy smiles. The women walked slowly, taking in every detail of this strange new world. The camp commander, Captain Roland Hayes, waited for them near the administrative building. He was tall, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He had spent years overseeing logistics up the Italian coast, but nothing in his career had struck him as deeply as the arrival of these British women. He stepped forward. "Ladies," he said gently, "welcome. Truly. You're under American protection now. We're here to help you recover, rest, and rebuild your strength. You've been through hell. That ends now." Margaret nodded stiffly, instinctively falling into parade posture. Old habits clung to her. Captain Hayes noticed and softened his tone. "You don't have to stand at attention here. You don't have to act like prisoners. You're guests." Guests. The word hit them like a gust of wind. Hayes continued. "This afternoon, you'll have time to rest, write letters, walk the grounds, meet our staff. Anything you need, you tell us. If we can provide it, we will." Anne swallowed. "Even things like books?" Hayes smiled. "Especially books, and warm blankets, and snacks if you want them." Lily gasped softly. Snacks. The word sounded almost mystical. The women were shown to their quarters, a long wooden barracks with painted windowsills, neatly made beds, and small lockers for personal things. Each bed had clean linens, 2 pillows, and wool blankets folded with military precision. On each locker stood a tin mug, a packet of powdered soap, and a small can of peaches. The peaches nearly broke them. Lily picked up the can with trembling fingers. "This can't be for me." "It is," Anne said softly. Lily clutched it to her chest like treasure. Eleanor walked slowly between the beds, running her fingers along the blankets. They felt impossibly soft. She stopped when she saw a small wooden table in the corner with a vase of, yes, real, fresh flowers, yellow daisies, placed there deliberately. Eleanor stared at them until her eyes blurred. Dorothy approached her quietly. "You all right?" "Those flowers," Eleanor whispered. "They feel like something from home." Dorothy nodded. Home. The word still felt fragile. They unpacked the few belongings they had managed to keep through captivity. Letters worn soft, tarnished photos, a hair ribbon, a bent cigarette case. They placed them carefully in their lockers. Each small item looked painfully out of place in this clean, bright room, like artifacts from another life. In the afternoon, the women gathered outside on the benches while the sun warmed their faces. An American nurse handed out notebooks and pencils. "For letters home," she said, "or writing down anything you want to remember." Lily opened her notebook slowly, staring at the blank page. She had tried to write once in the German camp. The guards had confiscated her letter and laughed at her request for a stamp. Now, she touched the pencil to the page and whispered the first words. "Mum, I'm alive." Her breath stuttered. She wiped her eyes and kept writing. Anne leaned back against the bench, listening to the sounds of the camp, the clink of tools from the motor pool, the hollow thump of boots during a drill, the creaking of laundry lines. For months, those same sounds, metal boots, commands, had meant danger. Now they sounded different, softer, almost comforting. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, memories flickered. The explosion on the desert road, the capture, the hunger, the cold, the German guard calling her the stubborn one, the barn she had kicked her way out of, the snowstorm escape she nearly didn't survive. Those moments had defined her, had shaped her, had hardened her, but now, she wasn't sure what to do with that hardness. Margaret sat at the end of the bench, staring straight ahead. Her ribs ached, but the pain was bearable. She remembered the French prisoner she had tried to save. She remembered promising him she'd get him water. She remembered being dragged away before she could. She wondered if he made it. She doubted it. Guilt gnawed at her still. But sitting in the warm sun, she felt something loosen inside her, as if a knot she'd carried for months had begun to unravel. Eleanor wandered toward the motor shed. The air smelled faintly of oil and grease. 2 American mechanics worked on a Jeep, laughing about something. One noticed her hovering at the doorway. "You need something, Ma'am?" "No," she said softly. "I just wanted to look." He smiled. "You a mechanic?" She hesitated. "I was." "Once a mechanic, always a mechanic," he said. "Come on, you can watch if you like." She stepped inside, drawn by the familiar clink of tools. For a moment, she forgot she was a POW. She forgot the cold and the hunger and the humiliation. She stood in her natural element, listening to wrenches and sockets, feeling the grease-scented air settle around her like an old friend. Dorothy sat alone near the fence, tracing the stitches on her bandage. She watched American soldiers jog past, their breaths steady, their faces relaxed. She remembered marching with her arm bleeding, snow stinging her face. She remembered Helen's screams. The memory wrapped itself around her like ice, but then she felt a presence beside her. It was Captain Hayes. "You're quiet," he said gently. "I'm thinking. About home? And other things." Hayes nodded. "We can arrange transport soon, once you've recovered." Dorothy looked at him. "I don't know if I'm ready." "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." His patience surprised her. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. Evening settled slowly over the camp, turning the sky a soft pink. The air cooled, carrying the smell of pine and distant cooking fires. The women gathered near the mess hall again, drawn by the warmth and the sound of clattering pans. Inside, the cooks had prepared something new: chicken stew, cornbread, and slices of bright orange carrots. Real vegetables. The sight of them made Lily gasp. Anne took her bowl slowly, savouring the rising steam. Margaret inhaled deeply, eyes closing. Dorothy held her bowl close, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Eleanor took a bite of the cornbread and nearly cried. As they ate, an American private approached with an awkward grin. "Tomorrow," he said, "we're making biscuits and gravy again. Just so you know." The women froze. He continued, "Plenty of it, enough for seconds and thirds, and yes." He paused dramatically, mimicking the tone of the cook from earlier. "There will be leftovers." The women burst into soft, astonished laughter. Something light, something alive, something they hadn't felt in far too long. Later, as darkness fell, the women returned to their barracks. Some wrote letters, some whispered quietly. Some lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to believe the softness beneath their backs. Anne lay awake, listening to the distant hum of generators and the chirping of crickets. Real crickets. Not rats scurrying, not guards shouting. She turned on her side and watched Lily across the room, fast asleep with the can of peaches still clutched gently to her chest. Margaret sat on her bed, running her fingers over the blanket, lost in thought. Dorothy practiced flexing her arms slowly, testing her healing muscles. Eleanor watched the shadows on the wall, imagining the shape of engine parts she might repair someday. Each woman lay with her memories, her scars, her quiet fears. But beneath all of that, something new pulsed. Life, a fragile, flickering spark, not full yet, not healed, not complete, but alive. And as the quiet night settled over the American camp, one whispered phrase passed from bunk to bunk, soft as breath. Are there leftovers? Not asked in hunger now, but in wonder, in disbelief. In gratitude, because for women who had lived on the edge of starvation, leftovers meant something far greater than food. They meant abundance, they meant safety, they meant tomorrow, they meant hope, and for the first time in far too long, every woman in that barracks believed she would live to see it.